Well, Ashley Mayor, we are so excited to have you here. You are a UF grad and you graduated in 2014. I want to say a little that you wrote 2 different honors theses, correct?
Yes, yeah, I did.
Not a common thing in general at any university. And you are quite the star. I wonder if you could tell us what your title is currently and introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So my title, I have many titles. So I'm officially working on my PhD at Georgetown University in the Department of History. In addition to that, I work full-time at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in the Division of Culture and the Arts as a curatorial associate, which essentially means associate curator. And as well as I am the co-director of the Hasta project, which is a nonprofit organization based in Puerto Rico that looks at the preservation of reggaeton music. We're building the first historical archive of reggaeton and urbano music on the island.
So you're a true Caribbeanist.
Yes.
However, you're also a Cubanist by training. And you put a lot of different knowledge sets together recently because you and your team were responsible for creating the marquee exhibit at the National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. I feel like we could say that 10 times and it still would not be enough. It's such a wonderful thing. So this exhibit, it's true. This exhibit went up in December and it is going to be up for 20 years. I think that's important to say at the start, because in so many ways you shape people's understanding of the complexities of US history through this exhibit. So I was thrilled to see that one of the lenses, if not the main lens through which you are analyzing the origins and expression of American identity is popular culture. And it's not just popular culture, but it's entertainment as an understanding of popular culture. Although as you work your way through the exhibit, it becomes very clear that you have not just touched on, but really dove in, is not a word, you have taken a deep dive into the indigenous past of the United States, African American history, Latino history, and Latin Americans' contributions. There's also Asian contributions. So I wonder if you could speak to how you and your team came to decide that you would make the focus of this exhibit popular culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am so happy to hear you enjoyed the exhibition. Entertainment Nation opened this past December, and the response from the public has been overwhelmingly positive. Our exhibition really looks at 150 years of entertainment history, covering music, sports, film, television, and theater, and a little bit more. And we cover those themes really to explore who we are as a nation, who belongs, and essential components of what is American identity, what we know as American identity. So covering 150 years from the 1840s to the present, we really decided to focus this exhibition in such a way that we recognize popular culture as an important part of the conversation around American history. It isn't just an escape from the problems of the day. It's something that very much reflects and is a forum for the problems of the day. And as historians, and particularly historians at the Smithsonian, who are focused very much on using material culture in our work, we went to the collection and we felt that our collection was really well suited to tell the history of the United States and the history of who we are as a nation, and all of the social and political issues that we have coped with over the last 150 years, and use popular culture to do that. Instead of providing a history of entertainment that would have been very much like a Hall of Fame experience, we wanted to complicate people's notions of popular culture and bring it together with so many other histories that they'll see throughout the museum. And so I will say that we also approached the project with the intention to integrate very diverse perspectives. We did not want to whitewash the history of the United States. We wanted to recognize that for many more years than is often acknowledged, people of color, indigenous people, Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinx folks, they have been participating in the creation of culture and certainly the creation of its history.
So in this, and now we don't use the word melting pot at all, and I'm so thrilled in this, this kind of universe of American identity that you have curated, but also that you are studying from the angle of the Caribbean, the area of the world that has endured, or at least the area of the Americas that has endured most consistently and persistently colonialism. How have you seen the contribution of Cubans and Cuban immigration to the United States, since 1959, before 1959, as contributing? How has that diaspora of Cubans contributed to the creation in the 20th century of American identity and culture?
Enormously, I would say. To start, Cubans, we're such a creative group. I think maybe everyone says that about their own culture, but I will say that for me, as a historian of culture and particularly music, I look at the waves of Cubans that came to the United States during the early 20th century, that migrated to places like New York and participated. So sorry. He's going to keep popping up.
That's okay. We love dogs.
Starting that sentence over again. So for me, as someone who's studied Latinos and Latin music, I really recognize how Cubans coming during the early 20th century, particularly in the 1930s, the 1940s, were instrumental to the development of things like jazz and Latin jazz. And the sound of popular music today wouldn't be the same without Cubans. I know that. I think that many people maybe don't recognize it as often, but in terms of rhythm and in terms of percussion in particular, so many Cuban percussionists came to the United States and left a huge mark on music. And as you kind of move through the 20th century, those contributions continue. We see enormous waves of Cubans that come post 59. And as they come to the United States, they're building their own cultures. They're participating in a fusion and hybridity of culture. In Miami, we see a lot more music that comes out of the same influences, Cuban influences, things like salsa and timba, begin to develop their own sounds in Florida. And certainly I see folks like Daimea Rosena now, who's this Black Cuban woman who, educated at the Berklee College of Music, and she has she's inheriting such an incredible legacy, I think, and you can really hear that in her music. Absolutely, yeah. I could keep going on. I feel like I'm going to go on.
Just as an anecdote, it is like a barometer of how much Cubans have contributed to the changing landscape of what is acceptable, what is mainstream, and what is ours, that when the United States first invaded Cuba in 1898 to 1902, the military governor, who was a famous, hero of the Indian Wars, as you will recall, General Leonard Wood, graduate of Yale, one of the first things that he did was to ban drumming. Because of course it was uncivilized and savage, and we were there as Americans to Americanize us. I use we for both Cubans and for Americans. And of course it didn't work. It was impossible to get Cubans to stop beating on drums of different varieties. But that says a lot about how we saw something as simple as percussive instruments. We saw them as an affront, as a threat, as uncivilized. And now, nobody would understand popular music without, of any variety in the United States, without the centrality of percussion. So it is really interesting how, I think only in museum spaces do you see and feel the affective part of how history works and how political struggles render this kind of change, sea change in what is acceptable, what is normalized, what is ours, and no longer even questioned as anything but shared and beautiful. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your own family's history. Your family, your parents arrived in 1984, which is an unusual moment. There weren't very many people who were able to leave in the 80s, beyond Mariel. So how do you think your own experience as the descendant of Cubans who left in that period is distinctive, that makes your experience and your identity as a Cuban distinct?
Absolutely. You know, growing up in Miami, as a Cuban American, but someone with family that came during this period, I feel that my upbringing was incredibly distinct, and particularly in terms of the development of my political consciousness, it was very nuanced. For me, my dad coming in the 80s meant that we didn't have as much in common with some of the other Cuban Americans that had been in Miami for decades. And even for my grandparents on my mother's side, who had come earlier in the 1960s, late 60s, it was still very we didn't have a lot of assimilation, I should say. I grew up in a Spanish-speaking household. There was the cuentos that I was told as a kid were Cuban cuentos. For my dad, bringing a children's book that he had had as a kid home. So much of my upbringing was really shaped around, you know, my dad's experience as a recent arrival by the time I was born, and the fact that he was still very much adjusting to life in the United States. And my dad in particular is a labor organizer. He's part of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 349 in Miami. And that also is particularly distinct to find Cubans and Cuban Americans having a very interesting opinion on labor solidarity, for example. So I think that my dad in particular, and his influence, and my grandparents who were also part of that, you know, working class. My abuelo was a carpintero. My abuela worked in a factoría, and you know, my dad was an electrician. And so all of these working class kind of experiences really shaped, I think, who I am as a person and how I approach understanding Cubanidad in the United States, or like being part of a Cuban diaspora, and recognizing that as my experiences differ from maybe the majority that arrived post 59 or very soon after 59, there is even more variety as you look at experiences of other folks who arrived during different immigration waves. One of the members of my family was a balsera who arrived in the 90s. And so my uncle came from Cuba just a couple years ago. So in many cases, I feel like I'm constantly experiencing new waves of migration, even with my own family, as the decades go on. And understanding that my ties to the island are very current. My family is still there. We still have a house on Calle Masson, right near the Universidad de La Habana. And the other family lives in Quibicán, and not too far from La Habana. So it's also a relationship that is very close to the island. You know, as opposed to many families that I think have lost some of those direct connections with, you know, over the years. Yes. Certainly.
Yes, and all that you've said, you have violated sort of the standard taboos that are characteristic of my generation's understanding of what you could say and what you couldn't say. I mean, it was at one point, you know, in Miami, when you arrived to Miami, that was actually the year that I arrived, 1984, from Kansas. And Kansas was like a whole different planet compared to Miami. So in that year and beyond, saying that you wanted to have contact with your family in Cuba, that you had contact with your family in Cuba, that you bore them no hatred or hostility, was absolutely taboo. And I started writing to my family in that year, to my father's horror, because he was right. He was going to lose patience in Hialeah if the word got out that his daughter was a communist sympathizer at the age of 14.
Which is so crazy that just having a close relationship with your family can have such political connotations. Certainly for me, I remember growing up, the calling cards that we would use to call Cuba, and we would call every week without fail. And even if I had never talked to someone, I just would be handed a phone. Now I can carry a conversation with anyone on a phone, because I just remember being handed the phone at a very young age and being asked to talk to my cousins in Cuba and talk to my family in Cuba. I remember sending things to my cousins. As a kid, I wrote a children's book as part of class. I think it must have been in second grade, and my family sent a copy of my children's book to my cousins in Cuba. And I remember when MSN Messenger started and you could video chat. I remember for the first time being able to video chat my uncles in Cuba.
Yes.
And you know,
these are dramatic,
those memories.
They're dramatic moments, turning points. I mean, absolutely. And it is true, though, that all Cubans require young children to speak to strangers on the phone, as long as they're a blood relative. And you're not allowed to complain. So yes, it is a common thing. So I wonder, what advice you might have for young people who would, God willing, watch this and consider studying Caribbean history, studying Cuban history, or going into a field like yours. It seems so selective. It seems so impossible. It seems like, a history major would not be the most profitable or the most socially rewarded, which is certainly in my case very true. I really had very little support, if any, from my immediate relatives, except for my mother, for studying history. And that remained the case, pretty much for decades, until finally I wrote my first book, and then my dad kind of conceded that it was impressive.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I can say for me, I would have never expected to end up where I am as, a little, Cuban from La Calle Ocho, grew up in Little Havana in Miami, whose family wasn't formally educated. My siblings barely graduated high school, didn't, in many cases, got their GED. So, I think that for me, I would have never thought that I'd be working at Smithsonian as a curator, or making a career out of being a historian, even though I had such a passion for history. It seemed so unachievable, but I am proof that it is possible. I think that, if you have a passion for the work that you do, if you have a passion for history, and you have certainly a passion for understanding where you come from, if you are Cuban and you want to learn more about Cuban history, or if you're Caribbean and you want to understand more a Caribbean context, I think it's important to study and to learn as much as you can. And if you continue pushing yourself and finding opportunities to practice that history, maybe in a non-traditional way, because I think for many historians, academia is the most direct route. But in my case, I started, before I kind of came back to academia, I decided to pursue public history and kind of find these spaces for doing historical work, doing historical research and analysis, but in a different way, still still educating folks, not in classrooms, but just in a museum setting. I think that for me, or in terms of the advice that I would give to newer generations, is to just do it. If I am always a fan of a plan A and a plan B. And plan A is your passion, and then always have a fallback. My fallback had always been, well, if it doesn't work out, maybe I'll just go to law school. And I kept telling myself that until maybe my senior year of UF, when we participated in the Cuba trip with you. And I think I turned to you during that trip and I said, I really want to do museum work after this trip, just seeing all these archives, talking to people, and understanding that there are various ways to enter historical work and become a historian. And now there's so many more ways with all of the digital technologies that are available to us, podcasts and so much more. I think that there's the options are there if you have the motivation and the dedication to see it through.
And the world is your oyster. Study hard. That's my that's
Yeah.
critical. That's critical. Ashley,
Yeah.
you also worked very hard when you were in school, 40 hours a week at a store in the mall, and you were always prepared for class. These are, I mean, they're sort of incomparable experiences for a mentor to see in a student. So before I cry,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us and for doing what you're doing, because it really is, it's inspiring, it's enlivening. And just that little bit, that exhibit, the fact that it is so representative of all these different knowledge sets that you have gained, and that they represent us as a country and will be there representing us as a country for 2 decades. I mean, if I were you, I'd take a nap.
No, I've got more coming out this year. I've got several essays and book in book contributions that will be coming up soon. Looking at comedy, actually, Latinos in comedy. So we're, you know, I'm never at peace for long. I love the work too much. So I think that really is telling when you want to dive into the next project, and projects really excite you.
Yes, exactly. Well, thank you. And when you do have those publications, let us know so that we can like post them, because we're going to start, I think we're going to start doing something like that. I think there's too much to put on this website for it all to fit, that I know that you have always supported. Thank you so much, Ashley.
Thank you.